Are there questions on the assignment? I know you mentioned one about in abiding. Is that today's assignment, do you know, or do you have a page for that? I mean, it must come up more than once.
It's throughout.
Yeah, okay.
It's just an awkward formulation. I mean, abiding is really abiding in.
Yes.
I don't know why it's in abiding, because I've also seen it as abiding in, which makes sense.
Do you know what the German is?
Not at the moment.
I would think in English it would have a, the in abiding would have a, what do I want to say? Not only, like if abiding is a intransitive, to abide is intransitive, right? To dwell. But to in abide, I think it has a transitive connotation. It's that kind of a difference. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's not a completely meaningless awkwardness, if I can put it that way. Any other questions?
It says Inständigkeit.
So what would that be literally? Stand. Okay, yeah. Standing in.
Standing in.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Questions? I, as usual, want to back up to the previous assignment. We had, I guess, more or less gotten to around 13 or so. Maybe on 13, I think I hit the point, but I just want to emphasize it again without necessarily going back to the text, because it's related to this more general idea. Another thing I anticipated last time, and I want to just point to it specifically in the text today. I think it's on 13 that he also speaks about creating as the restoring of being. So even though, or beings, and in today's assignment, he uses the term recasting beings. So recasting in the sense of a sculptor would cast, mold. So it's a remolding, remodeling, all right, reshaping, however you want to put it, is the idea. So even though he uses the term creating, he certainly does not have in mind anything like what we understand here by creation ex nihilo. Right? We're not starting from scratch. We're starting with some material, even if that material is being or beings in its, to use the language of being and time, in its inauthentic sense, or in the sense in which it is abandoned by being. The goal here is to create beings, meaning to restore them, to reshape them. They're reshaping or restoring to some sort of original state, understanding, however, not as simply going back to the past, but restoring them to their being originarily, in the sense of restoring them to their potentiality, right? And to their being, I guess you could say, not bereft of, not abandoned by being, or to their being in be-ing, in the context of the finitude and uniqueness of, for want of a better term, originary being, the being that was forgotten in the history of metaphysics and the history of philosophy, forgotten, as it were, from the get-go, from Heidegger's point of view. All right, so the restoring of beings as creating, and that the other, and related to that point, and so another way he puts that on page 18, I guess we could look at that. I don't think we looked at that. In the second paragraph on page 18, the prolonged Christianization of God and the growing publicizing of every attuned relation to beings have both stubbornly and covertly buried the preconditions by virtue of which something stays in the remoteness of undecidability of the flight or arrival of God, whose essential swaying will nevertheless be most intimately experienced in a knowing awareness, which stands in truth only as a creative knowing. So there's the creative idea again. And then he specifies, in its broadest sense, creating means every sheltering of truth that is in beings. So again, creating here is always going to presuppose either the beings that are being recast or reshaped, or, which comes to the same thing in effect, presuppose the truth that is in being that has been passed over in the metaphysical tradition. The metaphysical tradition which insists on quite the contrary of what he speaks of in this paragraph, insists on deciding about beings, you might say. In other words, which fundamentally is engaged in the contrary to the disposition that is committed to the undecidability of beings, and therefore to a kind of receptiveness, a kind of openness in Heideggerian terms to beings, which is the disclosive constitution of Dasein, which mankind, or man in this text, is called to ground or found in this. I guess you could say in Heideggerian terms, unique historical moment, I think that would be a way of putting it, which is the crossing, all right, between the first and the other beginning. All right. Yes?
The use of sheltering,
Mm-hmm.
it implies here just means maybe protecting or caring for that truth that is in beings, right?
Yes, I would say so. Right.
Because sheltering, it's a strange. Sometimes to me, sheltering would imply protecting it from harm in a way that, it's like very fragile or something. But it doesn't seem.
Yeah, I don't know whether fragility is the issue. I mentioned he uses the expression, in translation at least, of leeway, which I think early on commented in the first session. I looked up lee because I didn't know exactly what it meant, although I have a sense of what give me leeway, right? And lee comes from an Indo-Germanic root, or maybe ultimately a Sanskrit root, which means shelter, right? So it's not so. I don't think it's so much the protection, but it's the room in leeway. You see it. In other words, it's allowing room for something, sheltering it. See, so the sheltering of beings is allowing room for the truth of being. You see, to be disclosed. I think that's the sense of it. I don't think it has to do with any sense of fragility.
Sheltering is housing.
Yeah.
House.
Yeah.
Housing.
Okay. Yeah. Providing a place for, or right.
Like
something.
Heidegger's later building, dwelling.
Yeah.
Space
That's
building.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
helpful.
All right. All right. Now this, and then on the general, which is fundamental to this whole work, this language of en-owning, which we have some rough idea of, right? And again, the owning part is the irreducibility of the notion of self-referral. No matter how you slice it, no matter exactly what that's going to mean, we're dealing with some sort of owning and achieving of owning and enhancing of owning and some sort of thoroughgoing owning, right? To take the three meanings of en or er in the German that the translator points out as simultaneously present in that use of that particular prefix, right? So we're dealing with owning, but then we get some. Heidegger gives us, whether he intends to as we go along or not, from time to time he gives us some more concrete way of understanding that, and one of those is on page 19. Where, in terms of the effect of an owning, he tells us in the very bottom paragraph on page 19 that an owning, concretely then, so what is an owning, right? So concretely, an owning owns God over to man, and in that owning of God over to man, and by the way, if I just pause on that and put a little parenthesis, so that relates to something I think I pointed to last time, and it comes up again and again in the text, that whatever God means here, right, whatever the divine, if we translate it that way, means here, and it certainly doesn't mean, as he makes clear from time to time, has nothing to do with the Christian God, right? And I was pointing out it has much more to do with the kind of divinity that is personified by Nietzsche in the god Dionysus, right? So this is the god of nature, as it were, but of course nature here now, not the nature of modern science, right? But that nature which at least originally was the disclosure of being, right? And so we have a God or a divinity or a God or godding here, which among other things needs man, right? Or needs Dasein, to be more precise about it. Just as being, also being with the hyphen, that is to put it succinctly, finite being, or being which is originally and independently of any kind of recuperative Hegelian dialectic, independent of any metaphysical understanding, is itself, as it were, originarily finite and what? And I was going to say it's unique. Yeah, it's unique, but it's unique. It is the uniqueness of beings when its relationship to beings is not forgotten, right? When it is not covered over or buried over. So Enoning owns God over to man. In that Enoning owns man to God. And the German here, two different Germans, the Übereignen, the Eig part is what keeps getting translated as the owning part, and the Über, the owning over, transferring, assigning, conveying. All right. So an owning God over to man is that God, or the divine, we might say here, is conveyed to man, and in that owning owns man to God. All right. So there's a kind of reciprocity here, kind of Zu-eigen, that is, man is dedicated or appropriated to God in the sense of the Appropriations Committee in Congress. It's a strange use of the term. We don't usually think of it that way, but it's a transitive. It's a very active term. To appropriate means to appropriate funds. So it's not so much the taking in, but it's the allotting. To use a Heideggerian word, it's the allotting of funds is what goes on in Congress, right? The distribution of what's left in the Treasury, or what's left in our borrowings, right? To the various tasks of government, and so here man is appropriated to God, man is distributed, so to speak, allotted to the divine, and so there is that kind of inseparable, as I want to say, kind of a mutual assigning and being assigned, or allotting and being allotted in the relationship between God and man, and that's part and parcel of the larger notion that the Dasein itself belongs to being. All right, and then the other thing to note in passing here, on page 21, the notion is repeated in a number of places, but that Dasein is the between, right? So if there is a first beginning and another beginning, and if we are historically in the crossing from the first to the other beginning, all right, we want to be careful here in a Heideggerian sense not to take this in any kind of simply spatial context, right? But to take it in the sense that space with quotes is related to the spatializing that Dasein does, right? And Dasein does that spatializing in effect because Dasein is the between, right? So you could say it betweens, for one of a better way of putting it. In the middle, in the last paragraph of number 8, there on 21. This being, historicity, is not the same in all ages. Now, another thing, historicity changes from time to time. So right now it stands before an essential transformation insofar as it has been given the task of grounding that domain of the decision and the relational context of enoning, by virtue of which historical human being first of all comes to itself. The grounding of this domain requires a privation that is the opposite of self-effacement. It can be accomplished only with the courage for the abground. This domain, assuming that such a designation is at all sufficient, is Dasein. All right, so the domain, just to back up a little bit, right? The domain that is Dasein is the domain of the decision in the third line, and the relational context of the enowning by virtue of which historical human being first of all comes to itself. So the domain by virtue of which historical man first comes to itself is Dasein, right? Is being there. This domain is Dasein, and this domain that is Dasein is in being Dasein, is the between, which first grounds itself and sets humans and God apart and together, owning one to the other, which we've just seen on the previous pages. What opens up in the grounding of Dasein is an owning. With that is not meant an over against something intuitable, or an idea. Rather, what is meant is the beckoning, inviting, and a holding over across into the open of the there, the da, which is the clearing, sheltering, turning point in this turning. All right. I think the key word that sums all of up the thrust of what he's constantly pointing to, and why questioning, like seeking. He says last time in this assignment, which we're backtracking in here, seeking is the goal. All right. Analogously, questioning is where it's at, if you'll pardon me putting it that, right? I mean, questioning is where it's at. Questioning is the da, right? Is questioning. It's the openness, right? The being open, and therefore not preconceiving, prejudging, you see, as he would understand, in effect, modern self-consciousness, metaphysical philosophy does. All right, so there's a certain surrender, whether it's mystical or not. There's a certain willingness, in effect, here, fundamentally going on, implicitly, if not sometimes explicitly, a surrender of control. See, so that openness, that going under, right? That ruination, so to speak, of understanding, I would say, the ruination, the ruin, the going under of the controlling self, to a deeper self, to a self beyond oneself. It's that kind of an idea. Okay, and that into the open of the da, which is the clearing, sheltering, turning point in this turning. So the impatience, the natural. In your absence, Voltaire was going on at least once or twice about getting to the point in Heidegger, whereas I reminded her that you had said, I don't know whether you were in the room together at the time, that what you liked about Heidegger was that you'd always go deeper, right? So it's the same structure depending on how you look at it, right? The point would be from a Heideggerian perspective, right? Yes, what is required is the patience, which is the patience which is not needing, so to speak,
An answer.
Yeah, an answer, or to arrive at the point, right? To the in principle, the most important thing here, in principle, the understanding that what answer there is to be comes from being itself, right? It's as it were the work of being. And in that sense, generally speaking, we said a couple of sessions back, I guess, that there is at least a formal analogy to the role of receptivity in the thinking now occurring, right? Where the analogy breaks down is that the receptivity in the thinking now occurring is defined succinctly as productive receptivity, and productiveness is anathema to Heidegger, right? Productiveness is that which he associates with the creator God of Christianity, the maker, right? So productiveness for Heidegger means, fundamentally, it means machination, which we'll get to hopefully in today's assignment. All right. And then just, again, I've said it already, but just to nail it down in the text, and it's not the only place that the notion is put forth, on page 22, just about the middle of the page, at the end of those very short little paragraphs, the last short one being a being holds sway, and then being as an owning needs being so that being may hold sway. beings do not need being in the same way. Beings can still be in the abandonment of being. All right. Now he's going to qualify that in a minute, but let me just pause there. The first thing I wanted to point out is, yes, as he says elsewhere, and I've said for him anyway, Dasein belongs to being. But the belonging of Dasein to being, the reciprocal of that, is that being needs Dasein, right? It needs beings so that being may hold sway. So being is needful. He makes that point, I think, in today's assignment. He actually speaks of the needfulness, the uniqueness, I think it's the uniqueness and the needfulness of being. I think he pairs those, or maybe something else he pairs it with. But anyway, you say, well, and it shows you how slow I am. So I'm so stupid. I mean, I love it. I like to be stupid because when it finally dawns on me, I'm really thrilled. Whereas if I got it right away, I wouldn't think anything of it. So what is the needfulness of being? Well, what dawned on me is, of course, because being, we have to take seriously, being is finite from the get-go. Well, if you're finite, I got news for you. You got needs. Do you see? So it's not a surprise that being, which is from the get-go, in and of itself is finite. Of course it's needy. Do you see? Of course it needs things, so to speak. It needs beings. It needs Dasein, you see. It's a no-brainer, so to speak, but as I say, it takes a while to get it. Okay. All right, so being needs beings, all right? And then he says, but beings do not need being in the same way, all right? But then, lest you misunderstand that beings don't need being altogether, he's actually covered himself here. In the same way they don't, right? But nevertheless, in the next paragraph, but this seeming independence of beings over against being, as if being were only an addendum of representational abstract thinking, is not a priority, but rather only the sign of a privilege for a blinding deterioration. Okay? Understood from within the truth of being, what is an actual being is a not being under the domination of what is not ownmost to shine, a shining whose origin thereby remains hidden. This is interesting. There's insofar as Heidegger does not get beyond selfhood, which is in spades in the whole notion of ennowing. And even though he is explicitly critical of modernity, and to the extent to which he is, it comes out today, I forget how he puts it exactly, so I'm going to do this roughly and we'll hopefully nail it down more precisely in the text. But after launching this long diatribe about machination, about making everything, he makes the point that that's not to say that we can have being without machination, right? Or even more generally, he says, what is not ownmost to being, which of course is the problem, right? That beings are understood in a way in which they do not have what is the truth of being, you might say, being, finite being. They do not have what is ownmost to being. Nevertheless, not ownmost to being is necessary to ownmost to being. Do you see? And so I want to draw the larger picture here that this, and the other way in which I put this correspondence, which is at first sight exactly what Heidegger wants to distance himself from, this correspondence to the Hegelian absolute self-consciousness, absolute self-enclosedness. We said what? That what Heidegger really substitutes for that is not something beyond self, right? It doesn't occur to him. And there's no blame intended here, right? It just doesn't occur to him because it wasn't time. It hadn't happened. It hadn't occurred. How could it occur to him, right? We said at the time, making that reference back to Hegel, that what we have in Heidegger is a kind of, just as being is from the get-go and apart from the dialectic itself, in and of itself, so to speak, in its own most being, finite, you see. Analogously, what we have here is a finite, the comparison I was making to Hegel's term, absolute elasticity of the absolute idea. So we have a finite elasticity in Heidegger. And so what I want to say here is, notice we have another analog, muted, de-objectified, if you want, in Heidegger's sense of the word, right? De-objectified, analog to Hegel, nevertheless, that in this context he can say, which at first blush, if you read it superficially, is it seems to be a very Hegelian thing to say, and that is that being, that within the truth of being, now see, not within the truth of Hegel's understanding of being, but within the truth of being as Heidegger understands it, what is an actual being is a not being under the domination of what is not almost to shine. All right. So in other words, a being is a not being. Well, if I go too quick and I think of Hegel, first thing Hegel will tell me is that a being, the truth of being, a being has no truth of its own apart from its being a being for the sake of the coming to absolute self-knowledge of the absolute being, of infinite being. You see. So a finite being in Hegel, a finite being, qua finite, has no truth of its own. Right? And it's a not being, therefore, in some sense, in Hegel, right? And so I'm trying to say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference? Heidegger seems to be talking a kind of Hegelian language, but that can't be right. That can't be right. So what is it, right? Well, first of all, I would say he focuses on an actual being. All right, an actual being is a not being in the context of the truth of let me just understand in parentheses, of the finite being that Heidegger is dealing with. And it's a not being under the domination of what is not almost to shine. And the note I made is that what's going on here is that being is appropriating finitude to itself. Now let me try and explain that. In other words, what Heidegger is saying is that this is I don't know if it's a tongue twister, it's more like a mind twister. The actuality of the Hegelian being, which is an actuality or a truth that is not own most to it, if I use Heideggerian terms, right? But is actually the truth of infinite being, right? In Heidegger's context, that actuality or that truth of being is what the note I made to myself is an appropriation of the finitude of being, B-ing. In other words, the falsehood of being, how can I put it, in the reign of metaphysics, is that the attribution of actuality to being or beings is an appropriation of I want to say that the actuality of finite beings is an appropriation of the finitude that belongs to being itself. That beings have no true finitude apart from their relation to the finitude of being. So Heidegger, in effect, restores, in Hegelian terms, in principle, if beings are understood in their relationship to finite being in Heidegger, if they are understood in that relationship, if they are authentically understood, then they have, all right, in that relationship, then they have a then as finite beings, I want to say they are, I don't know that I'm saying redundantly now because I can't keep track of my sentence at this point. They are truly, as finite beings, they truly are. They are, right? Insofar as they're related to being itself. Insofar as that relationship is obscured, forgotten, buried over, then their finitude is as it were, illegitimate, false, appropriation of the finitude that originates in being itself. That's a little bit rough, but I think it's fundamentally accurate to what I think Heidegger is saying, what I want to say about what he's saying here. All right. Okay. Yeah, speaking of the needfulness of being, on page 25, probably can't state it any more forcefully than this. On page 25, in the above the four reservedness paragraphs, the paragraph right above that, as steadfastness of Dasein, care reaches ahead into decidedness for the truth of being, and especially sustains the allotment to being captive to the Da. So care reaches ahead, all right, as steadfastness, care reaches ahead into the decidedness for the truth of being, and especially sustains the allotment to being captive to the there, or the here. The ground of this especially is the reservedness of Dasein. This attunes only as an own belongingness to the truth of being.
You are in the paragraph reservedness and care, not above it.
No, actually, well, I'm in that large section, but I was reading from the third paragraph in that section, reservedness and care.
Okay.
Okay. All right. And another point which goes on here subliminally, I would say, although today it becomes an issue in today's assignment, so we'll get to it. But notice on page 30, and I'm sure you notice several times he speaks of a people, and
I
it's...
wanted to look at the German, actually. You probably see it says a fault.
I would assume. Yeah, I didn't...
In much of the reading of today's assignment,
Yeah.
what was echoing in my mind was reference to Nazi Germany.
Yeah, well, that's what you could almost
Yeah.
not make that reference in your mind, right? So it becomes an interesting question of... now, of course, he's not, in any simple-minded sense, committed to the notion of any kind of automatic notion of the virtue of a people, right? And in today's assignment, he raises the question concerning a people entering into a kind of historical role, right? So there you might see some, at least potential connection, although for all we know, he may have thought that what was going on in Germany was not a good example of what he had in mind, right? And I don't know that we'll ever know that clearly. Okay, but here's the larger point, which transcends the history of the 20th century, from in my understanding, is that it occurred to me, because he keeps making reference on page 30, but a number of places, and I think I'll reserve comment to more detail until we get to the section today. But in the thinking now occurring, this is something that could never occur. Okay. In fact, I made a note. When we get to it, I'll anticipate myself now because I can't resist. Okay. I would say that in the terms that Heidegger is speaking, the last possibly historically, how can I put it, authentically historical people would be the American people. That after that, there can be no more historical people, right? Because, and to think, right, so the tension that we're actually living through currently is the question of whether or not the American people can recognize that they belong to the past, or, putting it more broadly, recognize that what is obviously not in the past for Heidegger, right? That the how can I put it? That the well, this is not thinking now occurring terms, but in Heideggerian terms or Hegelian terms either, that the movement of history or the historical moment, be better Heidegger rather than movement, that the historical moment somehow that could possibly even be in that sense needful of a people, to use that, right? That the thinking now occurring essentially leaves behind that notion, right? And it raises an interesting question in my mind as I'm saying this, right? I was going to say, well, if an historical moment, right, for want of a better term, could, in the thinking now occurring, if it could be needful, and this is also a question, all right, whether it could be needful, but if it could be needful of anything, it would not be needful of a people, American or otherwise, right? It would be needful of, I was going to say human being, but then I really need to say human beings, you see, so that right? So if the historical moment were to need anything, it would need individual, particular persons in the context of thinking now occurring. It remains extremely questionable, although I don't want to think it through now. I would say in principle, it cannot be that the historical moment needs persons in the thinking now occurring. But if there were any needfulness, which there is not, okay, but if there were, by analogy, a needfulness in the thinking now occurring, it would be a needfulness for persons, not for a people. Right? And in that's another point of contact, strange as it is, with Badiou, right? Because when Badiou thinks of the particular, now he doesn't use the term the way the thinking now occurring does, because Badiou is anti-particular, right? Because he associates particular in his context with a people, right? Whereas the thinking now occurring doesn't have that problem with the notion of particularity, because it never occurs in the thinking now occurring. It doesn't occur to one doing the thinking now occurring that the particular would be a people, that the absolute particularity of the person is such, you see, that I would say in a certain sense it absolutely explodes the notion of a people. Right? The question that came into my mind, which I kind of alluded to, which I didn't articulate, it was only a question when I had not yet got moved from the notion that if there were any needful, which there is not in the thinking now occurring, in the historical moment, it would be a needfulness not of a people, but of, I was going to say humanity, something like that. And then I said, well, no, that's not adequate either, right? Because at the moment I was going to say humanity, I was about to say, well, then maybe one could imagine that there would be an historical moment which, if it were needful, which it is not, why would, humanity might be just analogously just a big people. How about Martians, to be absurd about it, but just to make the point. But then I thought that's a great thing about the thinking now occurring. It's got the base covered. You don't have to worry about it because it's persons. So it doesn't really make any difference what shape they come in or what part of the universe they happen to be, you see? Okay. All right. 30. Then, interestingly enough, I kind of skipped over it, but or did I? I don't know how I got here. Yeah. Just note that on page 27 through 29, especially on 29, he comes down heavily in opposition, intellectual opposition, that is, to the notion of worldview, right? And in a certain sense, he's very what's the word we use in English? He's non-discriminate. He's kind of, there's a phrase. The point being that he's opposed to any kind of total, as he puts it on page 29, total political belief. But total political belief. Now here he may have had in mind, you see, for all we know, total political belief. I mean, he could easily have had in mind Nazism. Or communism, you see. But it's hard to imagine, I mean, it's not stupid, so it's hard to imagine he would exclusively have in mind communism.
Or Christianity.
Well, no, and that's what I was going to say. So he mentions as the opponent of total political belief Christianity, but describes it as total Christian faith. All right. So what do these two things have in common, despite the totalitarian aspect of it? So another, as it were, point of contact, for want of a better term, another positive relationship between Heidegger's anticipation of what turns out to be an essentially new form of thought, his anticipation of that, which cannot be literally an anticipation of it, but another point of contact between his anticipatory or inceptual thinking in the crossing to the other beginning, as he probably would understand it. Another point of contact is his antipathy to any kind of totalization, and so the closest he comes to that, certainly in the German, as we pointed out, I think earlier in different contexts, is the notion of wholeness. Okay, and that wholeness is clearly in his text not an alternative to what he calls uniqueness. Right, so the finitude of being. The finitude of being and the uniqueness of being in a, I want to say, in a constitutive sense, right? That being is unique in the sense that it is the truth of the truth. It is the truth of beings. Originarily understood, you see, and the truth of beings understood in the context of being is the uniqueness of beings, right? And that uniqueness is compatible with a sense of the wholeness of Dasein, you see, and perhaps the wholeness of being, as we were saying, we were extrapolating, but I think it's a fair extrapolation here to try and understand what all this talk about the last God is. We were saying, well, if you think about it, the last God is not. Oh, it's not. You see, it's not the celebration that it might be if it were Nietzsche celebrating the death of the Christian God, right? That's already done. That's done by the time we get to Nietzsche. You see, so, by the time we get to Heidegger, right? That's part of. We assume that's a given, right? So we're talking about the last God and the guarding of the gods and so forth and so on. We're talking about not something that in turn is to be displaced, we were saying, right? But the last God coincides with that of the beginning, which is the one and only of the beginning, as he says. Do you see? Beyond which we're not to seek or expect something else, right? Or at the arrival of which we're going to celebrate, let's say, the death or the passing in that sense of the last God, right? But really, what I was trying to say was that it really expands the notion of being in time from anticipatory resoluteness in the context of being in time. The anticipatory resoluteness of Dasein is its being in the moment and being simultaneously, as it were, toward death, right? Toward the possibility of its impossibility. And in this context, we have kind of the term I use. We've kind of moved from the realm of Dasein up close, so to speak. We've panned out, so to speak, and now we're dealing with the being-scape, you see, which is part and parcel of the being of. Is that to which Dasein belongs, and which is that whose need Dasein fulfills. Well, that whose need Dasein is, or the answer to whose need Dasein is, that being is finite, right? In other words, there is something analogous going on with the notion of the last God to the being toward death of Dasein. That's what I'm trying to say. That as it were, being itself is being toward its own end. You see, it's being in some sense in its own most being. And maybe there we can speak of the uniqueness of being. To say not only its what I was calling its constitutive uniqueness, that it constitutes the uniqueness of beings, right? But yes, finite being is in that sense unique, right? In the sense that it's not to be repeated, right? Its limitation has this positive valence as the openness of Dasein or the emptiness of Dasein, however you want to put it, has a positive valence, potentiality, right?
Can you know where Heidegger discusses this notion of lastness or God as...
Well, it's going to come up.
Okay.
The latter part of this text has a lot on that. Every once in a while he'll mention, there's some allusions to the last God in our assignment so far, but it becomes an upfront theme later on, so, yeah.
What's the German here for worldview translated?
I think it's zeitgeist, but I'm not sure. That may not be it.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you want to really know. Okay,
I
see if
do,
I can find
actually.
it. What page is it in the German?
29.
29 in the German.
It says 40 through 42.
40 to 42.
Where is it on the English page? What page is it on here?
29.
No, yeah, but whereabouts?
Third paragraph.
Third paragraph.
Or if you go to number 14, the beginning, philosophy and worldview.
Oh, he's got it up there. Okay. Okay, good. Oh, Weltanschauung.
Say it again?
Weltanschauung.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, zeitgeist would be the spirit of the times. Okay. Yeah. Now that you know that, can you? Does it mean anything to you?
Yeah, yes, because it rings a bell with Wittgenstein, and
Ah.
that's the word he uses.
And give us context.
It's in the last book he wrote on, which is the only thing he wrote about knowledge and
Okay.
what it is, and so he talks about world views.
Okay.
But so I'm sort of, this is making me
Okay.
think back on
Okay.
that about, whether they are bounded or not or
Okay.
whatever. Anyway, it's a
All right.
long story.
Okay.
It's
all right.
it's a kind of, well, you've read this recently, right?
I
The
just read the
uncertainty.
philosophical
Yeah.
investigations.
It's a kind of non-dual epistemology, so I'm sort of curious here.
Okay.
It's an uncertainty, is what you're
Yeah.
On page 31, I don't know whether I already pointed to this or not, but it's another example of being needs Dasein there.
51?
No, 31, page 31. And I made references back to pages 22 and forward to page 60 where it comes up again. Let's see if I can find the... Oh, and then the other reference on this page 31, I think I anticipated this, effectively anticipated it a while ago in this class, and last time explicitly anticipated it. This analog that I'm making between Hegel as the metaphysical thinker and Heidegger as the, I guess you could say, post-metaphysical thinker. Would be a neat way of putting it. I think it's a fair way of putting it. But nevertheless, there is this analogy between the metaphysical and the post-metaphysical version, right, of the absolute elasticity of the metaphysical and the metaphysical selfhood, and the finite elasticity of the post-metaphysical selfhood, that kind of thing. So he says there, in just below the middle of page 31, in the paragraph beginning, because philosophy is such a mindfulness, it leaps ahead into the utmost possible decision, and by its own opening dominates in advance all sheltering of the truth in and as beings. Therefore, philosophy is masterful knowing itself, even though not an absolute knowing in the style of the philosophy of German idealism. So Heidegger's aware of this analogy, do you say? I mean, we're not just reading it into his text. So whereas Hegel would say absolute knowing is what the absolute self does, the finite selfhood of Heidegger cannot be involved in an absolute knowing, but analogously it's involved in a masterful knowing. And that analogy, by the way, is already set up perhaps for him by Nietzsche, because when you think of Nietzsche, Nietzsche's all about mastery, and despite any bad press he might have gotten, including a bad press that was reinforced by the Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche, Nietzsche's ultimate understanding of mastery was self-mastery, okay? Not the mastery of others, because the mastery of others was purely superficial from Nietzsche's point of view, right? I think he makes the point, putting yourself at the head of a million people is just adding 6 zeros to 1, right? So the notion of mastery and really self-mastery also, I think the Nietzschean notion of self-mastery is a contributing factor here to this reservedness, steadfastness, reticence. So it's kind of a little bit paradoxical, but really not paradoxical intellectually so. But in other words, verbally, it's paradoxical that what I also characterized earlier in response to your mystical allusions as a kind of giving up of self-control, meaning the self giving up control of beings, would you say? But that doesn't mean giving up control, but giving up the control over beings requires a certain self-control, a certain self-mastery in a Nietzschean / Heideggerian sense, right? A certain restraint. Right, in that sense, a certain sobriety, a certain temperance. I think of the Platonic idea of temperance here. It's self-control, right? So we have to be careful. Again, the language, certainly in English and maybe even in the German, for all I know, right? So yes, the giving up of of the self's control over things is only possible by the kind of self-control that resoluteness, steadfastness, and so forth connote in the context of Heidegger's text. All right, and this is yes.
Is there? You don't have to answer this
Yeah.
now. But is there an analog to that in the TNO? A kind of self-mastery, or I mean, what is it to be receptive in the TNO? It requires some.
Off the top of my head, I may want to take it back or qualify it, but I would say no, there is no self-mastery. In fact, I actually say, I think maybe in the Prolegomena to Novitas Mundi, I think there, but it might be elsewhere in that book. But it's probably, if it isn't there, it's probably in one of the appendices. I speak of the thinking now occurring, whether I use that term in that book, I don't remember. But in effect, I speak of the thinking now occurring as neither I don't speak of mastery, but it's analogous, neither self-affirmation nor self-denial. So analogously, the thinking now occurring does not contemplate in principle, essentially has no notion of the alternatives in this context of what I was just saying, of controlling others, self-affirmation would be the analog, or controlling oneself, that is self-denial. Right? It's beyond that. And why is it beyond that? Right? Why is it beyond denial and affirmation? Because it's beyond self. Okay? So it's free to act without any kind of reflection, without any kind of self-reflection. And that's why I have to say that the thinking now occurring is in fact the absolute identity of faith and knowledge. Otherwise, at least logically, there'd be no way of sustaining that or certainly explaining it, all right, or making it, as it were, intelligible. It's intelligible as far as that goes. Okay, now whether or not it's intelligible beyond that, it's up to you to decide. Okay. All right.
That's one quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe you can remember.
Okay.
Because I keep thinking of necessity and this needfulness of being, and remembering a few classes back, you broke down that word, I think in relation to whether or not, it was a question of whether or not the incarnation was necessary. You remember you went and looked up that root? And you found an interesting thing that seemed to relate to the thinking now occurring, and I don't remember what it was.
Well, I think what you're referring to was that having looked up whatever I looked up, I made the distinction on the basis of the etymology that what was, I think I'm not sure of this now, but I think it was the etymology is it goes back a long ways, but it probably goes through something like the nay in necessary is the not, and the necessary probably has either to do with the ceasing or seeding, that kind of idea, and so the necessary is that which cannot be put aside. So in other words, in that sense, it's the inevitable. So the distinction I made in the context of the thinking now occurring was that the thinking now occurring knows no pre-existent necessity. In other words, nothing. This, I think, squares with Kierkegaard's little, what does he call it? Interlude in Philosophical Fragments, right? He has a little interlude which goes on and on about the fact that nothing comes into being by necessity. This is Kierkegaard. And nothing by coming into being becomes necessary. Okay? Now that's part and parcel of his subliminal ongoing diatribe against Hegel. Because Hegel is all about necessity. And there is a certain amount of necessity in Heidegger, again, a kind of finite necessity. Okay. One of the manifestations of which would be needfulness. But let me come back to the point you raised. But in the thinking now occurring, I would say that it's half an agreement with Kierkegaard that nothing comes into being of necessity, right? So there's no pre-existing necessity. But I think there is a disagreement with Kierkegaard which is fundamental to the thinking now occurring, that once something comes into being, it is now necessary, not in the sense that it's right, but now it acquires, by having come into being through no necessity, right, having freely come into being, it now has a necessity about it in the sense that its being cannot be denied, or its being ain't going to, put it really crudely, ain't going to go away, right? Cannot be, as it were, gone around. Do you see? So now this is a two-edged sword, because this sense of the, what is the word? I guess it's necessity post factum, right? After the fact, right? Yeah, there's no necessity before the fact, but there is a necessity after the fact, which is the positive reading of which, but it has a negative connotation if you're on the wrong track. But if we're creating the world, then the notion that there is necessity in the thinking now occurring after the fact means that there is a finality to what we do. You see, what we do has a finality about it, which cannot be erased. Right? So in that sense, it has a positive connotation. Now, of course, if you put it in the context of ethics and morality and so forth and so on, then there is the implication, which is not stressed here anymore, by the way, than it's the analog is stressed in Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments. There is the implication that if you create in a deficient mode, right, that also has about it a finality, and it brings up another conversation we had, maybe not at the same time, but I think the question of judgment. And judgment has a lot of meanings, you see, but there is a certain sense in which judgment has a negative connotation. But the judgment here would be what you have. One is judged by what one has done, in the event that what one has done, all right, is deficient. It is something like that. Thanks. Okay. Now, again, 31, I already made the point. Being needs Dasein. Speaking of necessity on 32, all necessity is rooted in distress. On 30, what did I say, 32? Yeah, it's right there at the beginning of 17. All necessity is rooted in distress. And the next paragraph, this is stress is that which drives man round among beings and brings him first of all in front of beings in the whole and into the midpoint of beings, thus bringing man to himself, and thus in each case letting history begin or founder. What drives man round is his thrownness into beings, a thrownness that determines him as the thrower of being, of the truth of being, and then the nice little juxtaposition, the nice succinct way in which he puts that together. The throne thrower, or he might have said the thrower throne, the throne thrower enacts the first grounding throw as projecting opens of being unto being. Projecting open and Dasein, in the first beginning where man first of all takes a stand in front of beings, the projecting open itself and its manner and its necessity and distress are still obscure and covered over. The necessity of philosophy in the next paragraph consists in the fact that as mindfulness it does not have to eliminate that distress, but rather must persevere in it and ground it, that is, make it the ground of man's history. So there again, it's not a question, right? There is put it in the language of being in time, right? The everydayness is not. In fact, you asked at one point when we're doing being in time, do we ever get beyond thrownness? We never get beyond thrownness, right? And that thrownness has, as it were, in a Heideggerian sense, a negative form, right? In the sense that we are. In the language of being in time, we are in the state of falling prey, in the state of being lost in everydayness, in the state of the subject of our being the they, and so forth. There is a retrieve of original being from that, in the language of being in time, occasioned by angst and so forth, right? Which leads to, or is the possibility of a anticipatory resoluteness and so forth and so on, okay? But that's not, but this is momentary in every sense of the word, right? In other words, it's not a once and for all or final state of things, and therefore the the lostness is, in a certain sense, an irreducible condition in the language of this text, for the find that is the seeking itself. See, lostness means not seeking. Lostness right, everything's fine. I'm in control. I'm in charge. I'm familiar. No surprises, should I say? But the dreadful state of affairs is the state in which I realize that things are not what they seem to be. Things are uncanny, right? I have a profound sense that I'm not in control, right? And that openness, you see, is, however, that's not. If I put this in quasi-biblical terms, which, by the way, he in effect, if not consciously, is playing off in many places, I think. Then I'm no longer lost but found. See, I'm not lost but found, but the being found in the Heideggerian sense is being, as it were, in the state of seeking. Right? To be found, or to be the find of what is lost, or to be the found of what was lost, is to be seeking, because to be lost is not to be seeking. Right? It is to be in control, to use the language we were using before. All right. So the thrown thrower. But to go back to the question of necessity, okay. I would say that what we have here in the notion of thrownness, in effect, is a kind of pre-existent necessity that's far into the thinking now occurring, okay? And that's why, whatever you asked me, I answered the way I did. About self-control and control of others, right? Okay, so in the thinking now occurring, there is no pre-existent necessity. There's no sense of thrownness. It's a sense of a kind of perfect freedom, which is a perfect freedom which is not necessarily conceivably to be exercised thoughtlessly. Precisely because anything and everything I do with this perfect freedom is for real. And I use for real now in the Lacanian, Heideggerian, Peircean sense. The real, as Peirce says in very pragmatic terms, is the real is the other of what I think. You know what I mean? In other words, the real is what it is, whether I like it or not, willy-nilly. Okay? So in the thinking now occurring, we have perfect freedom, right? But with the proviso, it's not with the proviso, but before you jump ahead with that thoughtlessly, understand that the perfect freedom is to do that which is real, in the sense that there was no necessity to do it. Having been done, it takes on that kind of unavoidableness, that kind of undeniableness, you see, that kind of reality in the Peircean and even in the Lacanian sense in different contexts. So yes, we are free to create the real, and that, in a certain sense, ought to give one pause. Right? What we do is for real. To put it really crudely.
In the Lacanian sense, it always exists. It's an a priori, correct? It's something that
pre-exists. Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Whereas in the thinking now occurring, there's no pre-existence period.
Right.
So no matter whatever you can think of, it doesn't pre-exist. Right? If it exists absolutely now. Okay. So, all right. That was 32. Let's see what else. All right, the thrown thrower. So yes, there is the thrown thrower, just in case what I was saying, I think I said it in effect, but just to be a little more explicit with the text. The thrown thrower is the freedom, the open, the disclosing function of Dasein is the thrower. But the thrower is thrown. The freedom is, in some sense, I don't know if pre-existed is technical for Heidegger, but in the sense in which we're talking about it, it's the context, it's the irreducible context in which that freedom is a necessity. Okay. Okay, we're making some progress here. Oh, and the other major point, which again I anticipated verbally last time, I don't think I pointed to it in the text exactly, but I think it's important enough to do so, and that is, we did note, I think, that the word beginning appears in Heidegger's contributions, Beiträge, in a way that I think is, if not totally, almost totally absent in Being in Time. I don't think there's any, certainly not the emphasis on beginning. Now here, of course, we understand why, because what he's now emphasizing is this between the first beginning and the other beginning, right? So beginning is where it's at. So that raises the question, since the thinking now occurring is all about the beginning of existence absolutely now, what is the difference between beginning in the thinking now occurring and beginning in Heidegger? Or just to put it simply and directly, what does beginning mean in Heidegger? And I think one of the best places to appreciate that, which as I say, I anticipated verbally last time, is on page 38. And in number 20, at the bottom of 38, under the title, The Beginning and Inceptual Thinking, he says the beginning is what grounds itself as it reaches ahead. It grounds itself in the ground that is to be engrounded by the beginning. It reaches ahead as grounding and thus is unsurpassable. Because every beginning is unsurpassable, in being encountered it must be placed again and again into the uniqueness of its conceptuality and thus into its unsurpassable foregrasping. When this encountering is inceptual, then it is originary, but this necessarily as other beginning. All right, so if we pause there and go back to the beginning of that little paragraph, the beginning is what grounds itself as it reaches ahead. So it's in reaching ahead, it grounds itself in the sense that, and that grounding itself, it grounds itself in the ground that is to be grounded by the beginning. So in beginning, it grounds itself in reaching ahead. I want to say it goes back. In fact, I think we touched on this in a slightly different context in terms of, I think the way I put it summarily last time is that for Heidegger, the beginning is really origin. All right, and by the way, this is not unique to him. Right? In other words, I think it's fundamental to the whole of modern self-consciousness, not only in its philosophical context, but also in its, or of course Badiou would say it is the same thing, its mathematical context, right? In other words, in Foundation I point out that that center of the circle is a vanishing point. It is, I play with the Hebrew there, it's an abyss. It's a nothing, it's the point of nothingness. And it comes up in Levinas, and Levinas is really going back beyond to the point to the place that's in that pre-consciousness subjectivity that is literally for Levinas, and by anticipation for Kant in the Introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals, less than nothing. Okay, so the center of the circle. All right, so am I clear? The center of the circle, the analog of the center of the circle, the mathematical equivalent of it is the origin of the Cartesian coordinate system. Right, point zero is the origin, and the origin is nothing. All right, it's zero dimension in the sense in which zero means nothingness. All right, so beginning here is an expansion, right, in the context of a kind of original nothingness. Right, remember Dasein is the null ground of a nullity, he says in Being in Time. Right, Dasein is the null ground of a nullity. Right, so that same null ground, right? So here, beginning is grounding itself, but what could be the ground of it? You see, it would have to be a kind of nothingness. Read that in post-Hegelian terms, in a kind of finitude. You see, so in other words, in going ahead, it doesn't go ahead without, at the same time, in a certain sense, deepening. I want to say deepening. Firming up, grounding its ground, right? More firmly anchoring itself, you see, to its in terms of Being in Time, the temporalizing ecstasies of being ahead of itself implies what? It implies thrownness, but it also implies what? That there's something before the present, right? There is a past, even if it's not a past in terms of clock time. Right? There's a pastness, there's a fundamental pastness that is not I was going to say, it's not graspable in a certain sense. It is retrievable as a potentiality. To say so the pastness. So the beginning is grounding itself in a kind of nothingness, which has an affirmative, positive connotation as all emptiness and all what otherwise would be lack of privation in Heidegger. We clearly see by this time, I think, it has a positive valence, right? So the nothingness is the potentiality, which is deepened in the reaching forward, right? Reaches ahead as grounding and is thus unsurpassable. All right. But in the next paragraph, only what is unique is retrievable and repeatable, right? Only it carries, so the uniqueness, the limitation, the finitude of this beginning is that it is grounded, if you want, rooted in its potentiality, and the more deeply rooted in its potentiality it is, in what I'm calling here its pastness, right? The more deeply rooted in its potentiality it is, the more it reaches forward, right? In other words, because that potentiality is also, in Heideggerian terms, futural, right? So the Dasein in being in time, it's present, it's past, and it's present where it is its past, comes to it from the future, right? So we have, again, this finite elasticity, as I've called it, right? I guess you could say the fabric of which is this kind of finite potentiality, the finitude of openness, and it's unsurpassable, I would say, in a number of senses, right? Unsurpassable in the sense that this potentiality, which is the self-grounding of the beginning, is unique, right? And in that sense, unsurpassable, right? Not to be surpassed or replaced by something else. So he says, only what is unique is retrievable and repeatable. Only it carries within itself the ground of the necessity of going back to it and taking over its inceptuality. And this is typical Heidegger, and it's really tough to parse it, but I think I'm effectively doing so by saying, so we would normally say, right, well, you can't go, in fact, I said, you can't go back and, as it were, grasp the past, right? But you can retrieve it in Heidegger's sense, right? But you don't retrieve it, so to speak, as a kind of metaphysical past, as a kind of vulgar temporal past, as something that happened in the past. You know, we can rerun the film or something like that. See, we're going back to this pastness, to this originary groundedness, this originary potentiality of being there. Going back to it, retrieving it means retrieving the truth of one's being as potentiality, inceptuality, its beginningness. You see, beginningness here really means that kind of originality, right? That kind of potentiality, which is of the very essence of I want to say of being and of being there, or of being there and of the being to which being there belongs, right? Or to which of being there and of that to which being there is the answer, right? That is the answer to what is needed, right? Answer is the right term. Answer will do. This is probably a better term, but you get the idea, I think. All right. And then again, focusing on this uniqueness in that same paragraph, but in the last sentence, for beginning can never be comprehended as the same because it reaches ahead and thus each time reaches beyond what is begun through it and determines accordingly its own retrieval. So when I talk about this self-grounding in what is effectively the uniqueness of being, in the form of its potentiality, right? That potentiality is a positive thing in Heidegger, and that positivity of the potentiality translates in Heidegger into the uniqueness of its reaching forward. In other words, historicity is constantly different, as you said earlier, right? We pointed to that. You could say historicity is constantly unique, right? So the kind of repetition of unique moments, as it were, I think is a fair way of putting it. And what I'm getting at is that, and so he has no greater love at this level, at least, for the same than the thinking now occurring does, right? There's a problem. There's a problem with that in Heidegger, right? There's a certain inconsistency built into Heidegger. I think it surfaces from time to time in the text, and maybe we'll come across some specific examples. I mean, I did in my reading, but whether I can drop them down on the table right away is another question. But there is a certain kind of inconsistency in Heidegger, to which, by the way, which I would attribute to the fundamental inconsistency of modern self-consciousness, of self-consciousness in general, but certainly of modern self-consciousness, which goes back to a question you asked probably in the first class about the schema when I speak in the Prolegomena to Novitas Mundi that in the thinking now in self-consciousness, the thing is always at variance with its schema, right? Which is another way of saying that in self-consciousness, because of the fundamental opaqueness, right, the fundamental limitation, the fundamental non-arrival at what is projected, right, which is it's at every level, including Heidegger, it's reaching, always reaching from to, do you say, that fundamental structure of potentiality in modern self-consciousness translates in Heidegger into the uniqueness of each of the efforts. Okay, in other words, you could imagine, see, for Heidegger at least, and I think qua modern, if as it were at the root of beginningness or inceptuality was actuality, to say, then for him that would mean every attempt, every effort, every reach forward would produce the same thing. Do you see? But since it's not actuality in which the reach is grounded, it's potentiality, then every reach forward produces something different, something unique, right? So we have a repetition of uniqueness. It reminds me of Badiou in this sense. He's indebted. The more you'd be surprised. I don't know whether you would be surprised if you take a look at that text.
Being an event?
Being an event. I mean, Heidegger plays an important role there. He's quoted at key places in the text, not without disagreement, but certainly without any kind of total disagreement. And so one of the fundamental points of contact between Badiou and Heidegger is, remember Badiou talks about the event, of course, and the situation and the event and so forth, etc. And so Badiou is perfectly willing to say, and does say, that there are histories, there are historical situations, and there are historical events, but there is no history with a capital H. There's no one in Badiou at all, you see? And there's a sense in which he's drawing, or I don't know, he implicitly he's drawing on, it's maybe explicitly drawing on this aspect of Heidegger, right? That there is a series of unique events, if not in the fully technical sense of Badiou. And yes, there's a kind of uniqueness, but there's no ultimate single uniqueness, right? Now here's the point, because the only way he and Badiou can conceive of an ultimate uniqueness, an ultimate one, is in terms of absolute self-consciousness. See? If you could conceive of a unity which was not a unity born of self-consciousness or a reflection of self-consciousness, absolute or otherwise, then you would be beyond. Yeah, in effect, he says it so neatly. I summarize it in my notes here. On page 39, in that same rough place. Oh yeah, all right, in the next paragraph, I guess he puts it all together there. Right, he's already said, and I've quoted him, it's not, the beginning can never be comprehended as the same. In the next paragraph, he says, what is inceptual is never that which is new, because this is merely the fleeting item of yesterday, right? So yes, because again, in the language of thinking now occurring, the only concept he has of the new or of novelty is the everyday concept of the new, and the contrast of that in the language of thinking now occurring would be to speak of the essentially new, of which essentially new Heidegger neither has, and perhaps neither has nor can have, any conception of the essentially new. I think that's probably what it comes down to. So laboring under that prohibition, so to speak, the beginning is neither the same, it's never that which is new, because this is merely the fleeting item of yesterday. The beginning is, because in the thinking now occurring, what is new is absolutely now. So there's no possibility of its being that which is passing into yesterday, right? It's not involved in that kind of Heideggerian ecstatic temporality. It is not, all right? It's not ecstatic at all in that sense, right? It's not standing at a distance. It's not standing at a distance from anything, including most fundamentally and primordially, if I can use that term in quotes, not in the thinking now occurring, it's not standing at a distance from itself. Okay? And the reason, and that's easy because there ain't no self from which to distance the I. Okay. What is inceptual is never that which is new. All right, so it's not the same, it's not new. And then there's one other. Beginning is also never the eternal, precisely because it is never removed or taken out of history. All right. Okay.
What does history mean there then?
Well,
it's not. Because there isn't history.
Well, I think, as we were saying, where I don't know, probably in Being in Time, in our analysis of Being in Time, and it comes up here again. For Heidegger, history is rooted in temporality. So he really doesn't make. He not only doesn't make any sharp distinction between the two, but I would say that the historical which is to be understood in terms of a kind of authentic temporality, which existentially, AL, would be the being in the moment, right? So history, an historical happening would be a happening in the context of the moment, in the context of steadfastness, resoluteness, or whatever. That would be historical. But I think in answer to your question, it would be inseparably rooted in temporality. So in this context, where's the sentence? So he's contrasting the eternal with history because he doesn't distinguish radically between history and time or temporality, and therefore he's distinguishing the eternal from the temporal. I mean, I think that's a short answer to the question. On page 49, along with what I was pointing to last time and again this time, this notion, which more will be said about later in the text, the last God on page 49, defines it, if I can find the place on the page, somewhere on this page, which I don't see immediately. Anyway, he defines it as the inceptual mastery of the end. Do you see it? Yeah, right, there it is. Okay. So he says, the nearing and flight, arrival and departure, or the simple staying away of the gods. For us in being master, i.e. as the beginning and being master over this happening, this inceptual mastery of the end will show itself as the last God. In its hinting, being itself, and knowing as such, first lights up, and this lighting up needs the grounding of the essential sway of truth as clearing and sheltering, concealing, and needs their final sheltering in the altered shape of beings. There's another example of what creating means to Heidegger, right? The alteration of the shape of beings, the recasting of beings, not the bringing into being of beings for the first time, and certainly not ex nihilo, because for him, that's making. That would be the form of making, or creation as making, which is machination, which while it belongs to while it belongs to what is own most to being as what is not own most to being, it nevertheless belongs to it as that, and is, you might say, that the necessary and almost the necessary antithesis, but the necessary condition, what would be an antithesis in Hegel, the necessary condition for the grounding of the essential sway of truth. All right, but inceptual mastery of the end will show itself as the last God. But the reason I wanted to call attention to that phraseology in the text, it goes to the point I was trying to make about what's perhaps going on here implicitly, if not explicitly, and maybe this is a way in which it's being made explicit from time to time, hinted at, is the finitude of being, right? So this being-scape version of that to which Dasein belongs, being, right, has about it that kind of finitude, that kind of ending, you see, that death is explicitly for Dasein in being and time. So being toward death and for being, as it were, toward its own most end, all right, that's the other beginning, but they are the state. This is Dasein in the moment of anticipatory resoluteness. In effect, although I don't think you use the terminology in being and time, but we can use the terminology backwards here. When Dasein is in the moment of anticipatory resoluteness, in which it is originarily oriented or related to beings within the world, and simultaneously being toward its death, the possibility of its impossibility, that momentariness, originary momentariness of Dasein has its analog here in what? In that the finite being, the finitude and the uniqueness of being is such that its end is likewise characterized by what? By the last God as inceptual mastery. In other words, the last God is on the level of the being-scape, if I can do this. I'm doing it, so I guess I can. Whether I should is another question. On the level of the being-scape, the last God is the mastery of that ending of being itself, right? So it's not on the vulgar temporal linear time scale, right? The end and there's no more, or something like that. The whole impact of the end of being itself, right, is the mastery of it in the form of the last God, and that ain't going to happen without Dasein, do you see? And it ain't going to happen. Here reminds me about you, although Heidegger doesn't quite use this kind of language, but the structure is not dissimilar. All right, so the last God ain't going to happen without Dasein, because the God needs Dasein, right? And being needs everything, right? Being needs the gods. I don't know. It needs beings and it needs Dasein. It ain't going to happen without Dasein, and Dasein is called to what? To enlist mankind, humanity, you see, in this crossing, right? So everything is lifted up into. See, if it were consciousness, I'd be tempted to say the consciousness of the last God, but this would be a very dubious thing to import the term consciousness here. But you get the flavor of what I'm trying to get at, right? There is a kind of, in Badiou's terms, there's a kind of higher subjectivity, an immortality. What does the divine represent? And in fact, in one of his later texts, right, the fourfold, the onefold of the fourfold, one of the ways in which he describes that, here it's sky and earth, right? Yeah. Oh, but the other pairing is it might be the same thing in the text that I'm thinking of, the name of which escapes me. But the other two are the mortals and immortals. Okay. All right. So divinity, the God, the last God, is the last immortal. You could say too. Another way of putting it, the last immortal. But immortality has about it that kind of, I want to say, transcendent subjectness that the subject has in the event of an event in Badiou, right? And it's that subject, that immortal, in which the otherwise mortal human animals in Badiou are enlisted, right? And that's their immortality. They're enlisting and they're participating and they're being the support, as it were, for that subject, right? So, and there's a kind of needfulness of that subjectivity of volunteers, okay? Well, there's something of that structure, not quite that specific, politically, amorously, scientifically, and what's the other one? Artistically, or delineated domains of Badiou, right? Heidegger's not there, because if he was there, Badiou wouldn't be necessary, right? But Badiou is a nice follow-on, you see, to Heidegger in this respect, that there is this higher subjectivity, this higher selfhood, which is the immortal selfhood embodied in the God, and there is a last God. So this is a finite. I mean, one thing you could say about the last God, without any reference to the other issue I was talking about, namely that we're not looking for anything beyond this. But the other thing you say about the last God, and Peirce would understand this, you say, this is the God who is definite. This is the embodiment of a kind of finite immortality. You see?
Is there a sense as we get towards the end that does he point towards the death of the last God as well?
No, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
He speaks of the passing of the last God, but you see, this is a very ambiguous term.
He already is.
He's just moving. He's just moving. I mean, passing is a moving.
Yeah, and it's not past, right? It's not the disappearance of the last God. It's the passing of the last God. So there's a kind of, in fact, this might be what's really wrong with modernity, and the deeply what we're talking about here is the status quo. Right? The status quo may have this fantastically intriguing and ever deepening structure to it, but it's the status quo. In the thinking now occurring, you would say nothing will have essentially changed, right? Within the limits of nothing having essentially changed, then the call, what is the word? You know, the call, for Dasein, the call to have a conscience, the wanting to have a conscience, and so forth, is a kind of call to a kind of it's hard to find the best term for this. Acceptance is not enough, although there is a certain, in the sense of a kind of surrender, but a kind of in being beyond oneself. It's maybe a call to a authentic understanding of the being, which is to say, somewhat redundantly, an authentic understanding of the finitude of being. The nearest form of which is the finitude of being in the world. But Dasein is appropriated to being here, in this text especially. But I think it's that same. So that's so the issue then, I think, even though I don't think he uses the term much in this text, but the issue is still, for Heidegger, probably is authenticity. Is really the issue, and it goes back to an observation you made. He's beyond the question. I mean, is beyond the question of right and wrong, of the moral dimension and so forth. It's not not that he means to dismiss them altogether out of hand, but whatever meaning that realm or realms might have derives from this originary task of conscience, where conscience is really, I want to say, an ontological question in the fundamental sense of being in time, at least. Something like that.
Except authenticity has in fact disappeared in this text.
Yeah, I think
and since it's in some sense continues to be important, I wonder why.
Well, I think I don't know if there's an easy answer to that, but to the extent to which the focus is on being, now this is not an either or, but to the focus of the emphasis is on being as opposed to Dasein. In other words, the enlisting of Dasein in the structure of being, to that extent, I think explains the
That makes sense.
the shift.
Yeah.
Maybe in owning is more or less playing the role of authenticity. in a
Yes,
way.
yes, yeah. I think that's good. I think that's right. Yep. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Can we actually get to today's assignment? That's good. All right. And then on 51 and 52. And on 52 in particular, he says in the first extended paragraph beginning on that page, beginning a being, this word names not only what is actual, and this only as extant, and still only as object of knowledge, names not only what is actual of whatever kind, but rather also and at the same time names the possible, the necessary, and the accidental. Everything that in any way whatsoever is in being, including what is not and the nothing. Whoever, thinking himself quite clever, immediately discovers here a contradiction because what is not cannot be, he always thinks way too short with his non-contradiction as the standard for what is ownmost to beings. And of course you cannot help but think of Hegel again here and Heidegger's indebtedness to Hegel in his own, in his own context, because Hegel's solution, by the way, his verbal characterization of the overcoming of the contradiction, which is part and parcel of the dialectic, is the establishment for Hegel of a higher continuity. And Hegel's higher continuity in the dialectic is something like what I'm referring to here as the finite elasticity in Heidegger, or it's the analog of the finite, what I call the finite elasticity in Heidegger. So in the next paragraph he says, being means not only the actuality of the actual and not only the possibility of the possible, and not at all only the being of a given being, but rather being in its originary, essential swaying in the full cleavage, where the essential swaying is not limited to presence. Right? Now notice the way in which he puts that, and it anticipates something that he'll say later, and I've already anticipated, namely that what is not owned most to being is owned most to being. So in other words, even though he has a lot of negative stuff to say, especially I think in Being in Time, about objective presence, and the presence is, that objective presence is what he's really talking about here, nevertheless, notice, again, the essential swaying of being is not limited to presence, all right? So again, there is a kind of, I'm almost tempted to say a kind of authenticity to the inauthentic mode of being there, you say, or the inauthentic mode, right? It's not that it's authentic in and of itself, but the point is that it's that without which authenticity would have no meaning whatsoever, right? But likewise, the inauthentic that's the main thrust of Being in Time, has no true meaning apart from its relationship to an authentic understanding, in the light of which it then becomes inauthentic. All right. So it's a kind of radical structural relativity, I guess you could say, is operating here, and that's what I'm calling a relative structural relativity is what is substituted, if you want, for the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic. All right. Now, let's see. There's another.
Can we just
Yeah,
quickly
sure.
pause on just a few
Yeah.
paragraphs down?
Okay.
Also, there is no way that leads directly from the being of beings to being.
All right. You just lost me a bit. Which? Oh yeah. Okay. There is no way that leads directly from the being of beings to being, because the look to the being of beings already takes place outside the momentariness of Dasein. Yeah, I think the key word there is directly. Okay. In other words, if you put it in terms of being and time, if there was a direct route from the being of beings, notice where there are no hyphens, right? Metaphysical being and the metaphysical understanding of beings and their relationship to being. If there were a direct way from them to being, to the right, then there would be no need for angst. There would be no need for what in today's text, in today's assignment, he talks about a sudden, it's interesting, he talks about a sudden reversal, sudden reverse. You know, if he had any tolerance for onto-theological terminology, I mean, we're talking about some sort of a conversion, because most real conversions, you know, are sudden, and by definition, they're reversals, they're repentances, they're turning the mind, or metanoia in the Greek, right? They're thinking again, right? Okay, so, but this is tied in with this, right? So there's no direct route from being lost to being saved. Do you see? But being lost is, in some sense, the condition. It's the path you're going down when, like St. Paul, you get hit by the lightning bolt.
It's a necessity, isn't it?
Huh?
Couldn't it be seen as a necessity?
That there be such a conversion?
Yeah.
Yes, well, that's good. I like that, because that's the undermining of the conversion that we think of. I mean, the conversion we think of is not necessary. But this sudden reversal, if you look at the big picture, sooner or later it's necessary. Sooner or later it's going to happen. Now, it's going to happen in the form of the moment, and that moment is momentary in the sense of a radical temporality. So it's not quite the Kierkegaardian moment, which is a absolutely singular moment, because Kierkegaard is still dealing in the ontic existentiel world from Heidegger's point of view, you see. And therefore, when Kierkegaard talks about the moment as being absurd, right, one of the ways in which it would be absurd is that of this infinite succession of nows, this one is that upon which everything absolutely depends. That's absurd. Do you see? To single out that absolutely unique instant in Kierkegaardian terms, right? Okay. So the fact that uniqueness appears here and momentariness appears here as the frame, if you want, of authentic being in the world, nevertheless is not to be confused with any kind of final moment, any kind of, right? Now this is a purely linguistic game I'm playing, but just to make the point. If Heidegger says unique, the thinking now occurring says unicity. Not that he wouldn't use that term. I don't mean it. So that's why I say it's a purely pedantic, pedagogic point. Relatively speaking, where something is unique in Heidegger and the thinking now occurring, that something is, I want to say, just to get the thrust of it, very unicity. It's not simply something unique. It is very unicity, right? And that's right. So backtracking here to your question. So there is an indirect relationship, obviously, right? And that is that going down the path of being lost, we have something like analogous to conversion in our onto-theological way of thinking, but I think Voltaire properly points out it's necessary given the structure of, well, the structure in the first instance of Dasein, and then the second instance, which is not unrelated to it, of being, right? it is in that sense necessary in the sense of inevitable that there be this sudden reverse, right? And Heidegger could say, thank, with a small g, thank God. Okay. Does that in any way address your question? Okay. Okay, now there's another thing here. We'll go over to 55. There's another interesting analog that will help us perhaps, if not understand where Heidegger is, well, maybe, I was going to say, understand where he's at, if not where he's coming from, but I think it comes down to the same thing. It's interesting to me that he says on page 55, let's see, make sure I got the right thing, yeah.
What is a sejetic?
From the Greek sigan, verb to be silent. So it has it's his technical terminology, I guess, for this notion of silence or reticence in silence that he's talking about. But I'm glad you raised that because that's relevant to what I want to point out here. So just about the middle of page 55, in the paragraph beginning "in the end," he says, "In the end, however, reticence in silence is not an alogic, which would like to be logic in a real sense, but only cannot. On the contrary, the will and knowing of reticence in silence are oriented in a totally different direction. And just as little does it deal with the irrational in symbols and ciphers, all of which presuppose traditional metaphysics." All right, so let me put it this way in terms of the way in which I've been running an exegesis here of this text. So even though I point on the level of metaphysics, and what else he calls it? The level of metaphysics, traditional metaphysics, and mathematics of the origin as the zero dimension, as nothing. See, well, we're not on that level here. So for Heidegger, give me nothing, you've given me something positive, right? In other words, you're not giving me something. If you give me something so-called empty, it's really not empty, right? It's the opening, it's the disclosure, it's the disclosive structure, right? For the authentic or originary relationship to beings, right? For letting beings be, and so forth and so on. So likewise, when we talk of silence here, which is a kind of nothingness, right? Silence is the opposite of logos. So therefore, in metaphysical terms, it's the alternative to logic. You see? So he's saying no, because the alternative to logic is the irrational in metaphysical, right? So this alternative to logic, or alternative to logos, to speech, to discourse, in the metaphysical sense, all right, is not a negative. It's not to be understood in the metaphysical sense. It has a positive valence in my language, all right. And so reticence in silence, on the other hand, reticence in silence includes the logic of beingness in the same way as the grounding question transforms in itself the guiding question. All right, so it goes back to the point we're making in a slightly different context a moment ago. Being lost is being lost, but happily, and you could say necessarily, being lost has as its larger context, as it were, being found. To say, so logic in this metaphysical sense, which is bad, right? Relatively bad, you understand? Relatively bad. I have to be careful here. You understand? I'm speaking. You get smiles on tape. Which is bad in quotes, right? Metaphysics, which is bad in quotes, is nevertheless that which is not erased by being saved from it. Right? It's not erased, it's not done away with, right? But it is, as it were, contextualized. It's put in its proper, it's properly understood. Yeah, it's really, for the first time, understood in that sense in which its understanding is of being able to deal with, right? So it's not a question of erasing logic or erasing the metaphysical understanding of logic, but it's a question of being able to. It's a question of understanding it. It's a question of understanding it, being able to deal with it, so to speak, properly, right? So again, remember the anticipatory resoluteness, the moment of anticipatory resoluteness is not an escape from the actual factical possibilities, but it's the ability to discriminate that among the actual factical possibilities, which is that which is necessary to authentic Dasein from all of those chance possibilities, you see, that would otherwise, in the absence of understanding, the understanding of the actual factical situation, right? So we're not, this is not an escape. So in this sense, right, so this is why, in this sense, this is the attempt not to be otherworldly, you see. I mean, it's an attempt not to be mystical, right? So there's an acceptance of the actual, there's an acceptance of the existential. I mean, the existential doesn't erase the existential, it grounds it, it roots it, right? It understands the existential in Heideggerian terms. So my actual factical situation is not put out of play by my resolute anticipation of the possibility of my impossibility, but it enables me, now I can use the N in some normal English sense, see? It enables me, you see that? It N understands me. It N thinks me. Right? It enables me to authentically deal with that actual factical situation. That's the whole issue for it, right? And it has about it something. I mean, as I'm saying this, it kind of reminds me of Aristotle, because Aristotle doesn't give you a list of things to do and not to do. He gives you the framework in which you must act ethically, and I'm thinking of Aristotle's ethics, right, which would be an analog now, because this is not ethics, but the analog would be in Heidegger. What we're describing here is the structure and constitution of authentic being in the world, and of authentic being, right? It's not a substitute for your fate, for your selecting in the moment that possibility from among the range of what otherwise would be indiscriminate possibilities, right? Being able to discriminate that one which is necessary, right? So, so in that sense, so now applying this on the being-scape, as I put it, what he has just said there at the end of that paragraph, reticence and silence includes the logic of beingness in the same way as the grounding question transforms in itself the guiding question. And the way I drew this in the margin for myself, and I've drawn this before, this is the analog. Remember, years ago, seems like probably is years ago. One of the things I said in going from Aristotle to Aquinas was that if I drew a circle in Aristotle and I labeled the circle essence, then for Aristotle, what would be existence, now there's a certain amount of anachronistic thing going on here, but what would be existence for Aristotle would be a circle within the larger circle, so that essence would contain within itself existence. And then the reason I did that was I wanted to contrast that with Thomas, for whom, and again there's a certain anachronistic semantic play going on here. If I drew that same circle of essence, let's start with that in Thomas, instead of it containing within itself the smaller circle of existence, in Thomas, the existence would be the larger circle that contained essence. Now, of course, literally speaking in Thomas, as I think I pointed out once in a while, just to make sure we're on the same wavelength, that so-called existence in Thomas is really esse. It's the act of being. Now, it's certainly it has some of the meaning of existence, but it doesn't have the temporal spatial meaning that existence comes to have in the modern period. Okay, so with that qualification, with Thomas, existence breaks out and surrounds the confines of essence, right? And that's a function of the creation of what otherwise were eternally actual essences, or essences which were eternal actualities. All right. Now, the reason I bring that up is what's really interesting to me is the indebtedness at the deepest level of Heidegger to this very tradition. And of course, it's not contrary to what we've just been saying, right? He is indebted to he is entangled in the tradition. He's got to know he's entangled in the tradition. The question is understanding the tradition, not obliterating it, not denying it. I think he makes that point explicitly in today's assignment somewhere. I don't know if he's using the word tradition, but maybe it has to do with history. So he doesn't either want to say that past history was false, he says, nor does he want to say, as Hegel would say, Hegel would never say past history was false. He would just say it was leading up to us, right? In other words, that past history was not false, but it was an inadequate or incomplete realization of what we now understand to be the truth. Heidegger wants to distance himself from both of those readings of the past, of history or tradition. The past, the tradition, is neither false, nor is it simply leading up to the present, because remember he's told us somewhere in today's assignment, I think it was last time's assignment, that historicity is different in each moment, so to speak, right, from time to time. It has a uniqueness, okay? So what was the point? But the analog, therefore, all of that said as a context for what I want to point out is that if you were to diagram what he's just said in this section, the grounding question, which corresponds to the sigetic, to the reticence in silence, right? The grounding question, the decision here, the real decision, which he says somewhere later in today's assignment, if we can get to it, I think we might. But if we don't get to it, we'll say it anyway. The decision for Heidegger is the decision not to decide. Right? In other words, it's a leaping off the need to decide, which the decidedness of self-consciousness, which is just a form of controlling, the need for certainty that goes back to Descartes. Do you see? So the abandonment of self-control, self-control paradox, right? The abandonment of the self-controlling, the self-needing to control, the abandonment, therefore, the need for certainty, you see? Therefore, there's a leap here, therefore there's no direct, right? So the sudden reversal is at one and the same time a leap, right? The so-called, the necessary conversion is a leap into this, between this, right? It's really, it's a leap into, what we said that the Dasein is the between. So it's a leap into, you could say, Dasein's authentic self, or it's the leap of the self, or it's the leap of the few. This is another characteristic of Nietzsche that reappears of those few who are going to make this leap, the forerunners, those who in one sense are to come, or the forerunners of those who are to come. There's a certain ambiguity, I think, in the way in which he uses that terminology. But there's no doubt that this is not going to be a wholesale movement. Okay, this is going to be led by a few on various levels, right? And so the few who make this, who undergo this necessary conversion, undergo what in effect is a necessary leap, but the necessity is made palatable by the notion, what I was about to say was in effect, that this leap into the between, or into the betweenness, which is the between of the first and second beginning, is a leap into one's own most being. Do you see? So it is, in this deeper sense, a form of self. Now I have to be careful here. I don't know whether Heidegger would be happy with the term. Maybe not self-realization, but self-achievement. Go back to the end. Self-achievement, self-enhancing. It's a being self thoroughly, through and through self. Right? Do you see? And in that sense, it's authentic, and in that sense, it doesn't require any notion of infinity. You see, the whole issue is to be authentically, is to be, right? Okay. So did I finish the image? So where Thomas would have essay enclosing essence, in effect, Heidegger has the grounding question.
Wasn't it the other way around?
No, not Thomas. Thomas has essay, the act of being.
The act of being surrounding essence.
Surrounding us, yeah. Analogously, what I'm saying here in this paragraph, you put it all together, the siegetic, the reticent silence that corresponds to the grounding question, and that led me into a detour that the decision is the decision not to decide in the sense of metaphysics. That's the decision to be open, the decision to, as it were, risk, the decision to go beyond oneself, to say. That grounding question and the reticence and silence is in the place of, and Heidegger in his own way knows this critically, I mean, by way of criticism of medieval thought. I don't think it's an adequate criticism, but there's a good deal of truth in it, is analogous to the act of being in Thomas, right? And the place of essence in Thomas is occupied here by by metaphysics, by the guiding question, and logic. Okay, you see? And now, when I say that, I add what I hadn't thought of until I said it. That's a great thing about saying something. Saying that, it occurs to me that one way of understanding what has transpired since Thomas, even though there's a formal analogy there, one thing you can say about Thomas, which is not his fault, there's nothing historical about either essay or essence in the modern sense. And so, certainly in the modern sense, Heidegger, in effect, has, I want to say, historicized, and therefore for him temporalized, what otherwise would be the act of being and essence. He has historicized and temporalized the grounding question as something that now occurs in the crossing in a unique moment of history, do you see, following upon what is now contained in the middle of the circle of the grounding question and the reticent silence appropriate to it, the guiding question and logic, which now has been historicized as the first beginning. Do you see what I'm saying? So this analogy is not only transformed, but in the transformation, the historical element has become part and parcel. It's thoroughly historicized and temporalized in that modern sense in which history and time are not fundamentally to be in any way finally distinguished. All right. We've already touched on it, so I won't dwell on it, but the terminology, the sudden reverse on page 58, we might just note not only is it a sudden reverse, and I think he must say somewhere, we've already made the point, so it takes seriously, it presupposes as its condition the going in the wrong direction. Okay, so the going in the wrong direction, inauthenticity has its necessary place, so to speak, in authentic being. But another point, along the same lines, by the way, is a little below the large middle paragraph on page 58, the short two-liner. This reverse, however, is not simply a formal trick to alter the meaning into mere words, but rather transformation of man himself. Okay? So there's another application of what we're talking about here. In other words, man himself, untransformed, ain't so hot. Right? But the ain't so hot man himself, untransformed, Badiou, you see, the living animal, right? The species man, among other species, transformed, brought up into this higher realm of the Badiou's subject, or here into the realm of authentic being, right? that's a transformation. That's a good. And he says in the second paragraph after the transformation of man, he means becoming other in what is ownmost to him, insofar as in the hitherto accepted interpretation, rational animal, the relation to beings is included, though psychologically hidden and misconstrued, right? But not grounded and unfolded as the ground of what is ownmost, right? So as rational animal, man has a relation to beings, but the true relationship is hidden in that inauthentic mode of being in relation to the world, to other beings, and the including of that rational animality. Now, I didn't have time to think this out, so I don't know whether I can come up with it. But you need to put rational animal in a circle inside a bigger circle, and then you need to find the appropriate, succinct one-liner for the bigger circle, because that's what he's talking about here. In other words, again, it's not a question of erasing, right, rational animality. It's a matter of understanding it in the full Heideggerian sense of enabling it to be authentically, right? Hitherto, rational animality was not enabled to be authentically. I think the fundamental notion. So whatever that is, there must be some clue as to what that is. Well, we know what it is, but I want some nice, neat terminology for it. It's the post-metaphysical understanding, is that which is the larger understanding in terms of which rational animality is encompassed. All right. And then again, fundamental notion reiterated in different ways throughout the text on page 60, goes back to pages 17, 22, 31, and ahead to page 98 in today's assignment. The notion of the ennowning of Dasein again. So he says in the end of 42, right before 43, the territory that comes to be through and as the way of end thinking of being is the between that ennowns Dasein to God, right? Which is another way of saying, since he's already told us that the between is Dasein, it's Dasein being itself, ennowns itself to God, you might say, transfers itself to God, dedicates itself to the divine. What was the other thing I came across in speaking here about the divine, the God, the divine? There was another term that popped into my head, which I can't retrieve at the moment, but nevertheless useful. And in this endowment, man and God first become recognizable to each other, belonging to the guardianship and needfulness of being. So as it were, the co-belonging of man and God in the ennowning of Dasein to God, all of that is encompassed in the larger, I would say the larger and ultimate concept of the belonging to the guardianship and needfulness of being, all right, which we've already expounded upon, right? Why the needfulness of being? Why this being is needy? Why is Dasein to shelter and guard being? Because it's finite, right? Because it's not simply a done deal. It's not a simple actuality. It's something that needs Dasein in order, as it were, to come into its ownmost truth.
But it does suggest then a certain perishability, a certain fragility as
a perishability, except not in an everyday sense. Okay, remember his discussion about death and dying. Mm-hmm. He made the people. I don't know in English. Is it a verb to demise? Do we say that? We say somebody. How do we use it?
His demise.
His demise. Yeah. All right, his demise. We have a substitute for death, demise. We have a substitute for death, passing away, and then we have a substitute for dying as perishing. and if I recall correctly in Being and Time, he distinguishes perishing as the death of living things, as I recall. So now, I interrupted you. What was the point you were going to make?
The point I was trying to make is that since it needs the sheltering, it needs the guardianship and the needfulness.
Okay.
It just suggested a perishability.
Well,
vulnerability.
it suggests the analog of a natural perishability. That's the
Right,
point. It
okay.
suggests it's just the analog of the possibility of impossibility of Dasein. It suggests, in other words, the end of being itself, which will be the occasion for the mastery, the inceptual mastery, now you see, the mastery which goes back to the origin and realizes as it were, the original potentiality of being, of finite being. It's the analog of the end of being, which is the mastery of which is the last God. So
That is the end of being?
the mastery of the last God.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not a natural event. I want to say it's a constitutional event. But it's an historical event. But then an historical event within I want to say the pre-given. Yeah, it probably is the pre-given structure of temporality. Within the pre-given temporal, the pre-given ecstatic structure of temporality. So there is a kind of self-surrender here. There is a kind of thinking now occurring likes this, by the way, as far as it goes. It likes the idea that authentic being doesn't, in a certain sense, doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't plan ahead, right? Because planning is something that the metaphysical being does, metaphysical man does. Machinations, they got all kinds of plans, blueprints and so forth, and build. You see how quick they put up the Twin Towers again, right? But nevertheless, there are lots of plans, and there's a lot of discussion going on, and so forth and so on, right? So what you're looking for, I'm very empathetic to what you're looking for, but you ain't going to find it. Because thrownness ain't going to go away. And the genuine finitude of being is such. You see, if you, like if you had like an end that you could survive, right? You say, if you could, right? I think your question, the thrust of your question, is a kind of wanting to be able to anticipate, not just anticipating the end, but anticipating the end in the way of surviving it, right? Being able to then kind of nail it down and kind of finally simply define it, right? But genuine finitude is something beyond, I think for Heidegger, beyond both definiteness and indefiniteness. I think that's a fair way of putting it. I don't know whether that's satisfying or not, but okay, yeah.
What it is?
I think in the TNO it's clear that being itself has changed.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. Go on.
But I guess the question is has being itself changed in this movement, in this crossing, or is it here we have it saying, that mankind, the transformation of man.
Right.
Now, is that the same? I mean, here, because Dasein and being in the world are completely co or dependent or something.
Right.
Is that the same as saying that being itself changes?
Well, I would say, you could say in Heidegger that, being itself. I don't think being itself is a term that he uses technically. I mean, once in a while the language lines up that way.
That would turn it into a being if you say being itself.
Well, no, I'm glad you said that, because that's...
I'm wrong?
Well... It's not that simple. But it's, that observation is very relevant to something he does in today's assignment. I guess I would say that being itself would turn it into something in Heidegger's language that would be transcendent to being in the world, I think. And so the being that he's talking about here, this finite being, is probably, strictly speaking, not being itself, although it may, as I say, contextually from time to time be phrased that way, but I don't think that's the thrust of it. It's not being itself, and certainly not in a Thomistic sense, right? Now, but your original question, does being, parenthesis, well, let's say, does being, in the fullest Heideggerian sense, does it change? Is that the question? Yeah. I would say, does it essentially change? No, I would say, but it changes from time to time. I would say it's the originary analog of what I identified probably in Novitas Mundi somewhere, maybe in Appendix Alpha, as the scientific notion of an object constantly changing. So I don't want to reduce being in Heidegger to an object objectively present, right? But the undermining of that notion of constantly changing scientific objects would be some kind of constant change. All right? Now it gets trickier than that, because we go back to being in time, constancy and self-constancy. In other words, it's not only that it's the undermining of the constantly changing thing in physics, undermining constantly changing, but it's the undermining of the notion of constancy, right? In other words, so constancy takes on more than, and this is why it becomes, I think, I just feel coming from that corner a kind of unsatisfiable dissatisfaction. Okay, I don't want to read too much into it.
Don't.
But in other words, a constantly changing thing. Constancy has that kind of accessibility. But now when I get the originary meaning of constancy, damn it, it turns into this kind of reticence, this kind of resoluteness, this kind of anticipatory resoluteness, this kind of momentary understanding of what I don't want to say really, I don't want to say actually, but what I'm truly, I think you can say that, truly dealing with. Do you see? Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't advance me very far, so to speak. Right? In that moment, in fact, in that moment, that's an analog to the absolute now, thinking now occurring. In that moment, there's no question of advancing. Because by definition of the moment, I'm already at the end. I'm already there. That's the whole idea, is, as it were, to incorporate the end into this moment. And that's part and parcel of authenticity. So my death is not something outside of me, as if I were a thing who could be observed dying or perishing as a natural living entity. Right? I don't know who asked the question. Did you ask a question? Somebody.
Being changing, or that.
Yeah. So, yeah, being is changing, but so everything becomes what do we mean by that? It's moment to moment, right? There's a momentariness of being, but it's not the absolute Kierkegaardian moment. It's not the one and only moment.
Maybe
and yet, wait a minute, let me just finish the thought. But yet, notice the moment has, in this context, as its parameters, a one and only beginning and a one and only end. So there's a one and onlyness. Reminds me of Peirce. See, all these moderns, they cop out when they get to the middle. They cop out. They boot it. Right? You've got a one and only beginning and a one and only end. Say Peirce. Absolute first, absolute second. Say Peirce. But the middle, by its very nature, is relative. I have a one and only beginning in Heidegger, a one and only end in Heidegger. What's frustrating is that the middle, the between, the Dasein, ain't one and only it ain't a one and only moment. Do you see? It's within the parameters. It is some. He said a repeatable retrieving of the beginning. He just told us a few pages back, right? The beginning is retrievable and repeatable, even though it ain't the same. So I have I have to be careful of the language here. I want to say series, but I don't know what that means, right? I have more than one moment possible within the limits of a one and only beginning and a one and only end. Within the limits of finitude. Right? So no one of these, right? So I can have, I think that's it. And I think that's the answer to your question, or something like that. Okay, where are we? 60. On the uniqueness, on page 63, he makes the point that beings happen but once. That's another version of the uniqueness. The few and the many, I'm not going to dwell on that, 68, 66, 68. I do want to spend the last 5 minutes or so, or at least begin the last 5 minutes or so, by going to page 77, because it's something that Waltraud made me think of a moment ago. And it's kind of tricky, but I think it's worth exploring, because one of the things, especially in today's assignment, that he keeps distancing himself from is, well, of course he's distancing himself from the whole metaphysical tradition, but part and parcel of that metaphysical tradition he understands to be Christian theology, medieval theology, Christianity, and so forth, and the Christian understanding of God. So on page 77, speaking in the context of the abandonment of being, he says, abandonment of being is strongest at that place where it is most decidedly hidden. That happens where beings have and had to become most ordinary and familiar, which is something we ought to be familiar with by now. That happened first in Christianity and its dogma, which explains all beings in their origin as ens creatum, where the creator is the most certain and all beings are the effect of this most extant cause. But cause-effect relationship is the most ordinary, most crude, and most immediate, what is employed by all human calculation and lostness to beings in order to explain something, i.e. to push it into the clarity of the ordinary and familiar. Now, of course, as I say, there's no simple answer here with Heidegger, because there's a lot of truth in what he says, but there's no clear demarcation of the actual history of thought in the context of, let's say, Novitas Mundi. So, for example, the idea of cause is introduced really seriously into Western thought by Aristotle. And there's one thing you can say about Aristotle, that he was not enamored of calculating. Right? Aristotle has no high regard for calculation in philosophy, and so there's a kind of thinking now occurring, or Novitas Mundi, or I would understand to be a kind of blurring of what should be the some sharp distinctions in the history of thought, of philosophy, between Aristotle and Thomas and Descartes and Hegel and so forth, right? So because Heidegger wants to say that there's one continuous thing called the first beginning, which goes back to the Greeks and runs up through I guess Nietzsche or whatever, the end of philosophy, he's not too careful about making certain distinctions. All right, so he says, we're on page 77, right? So he says in the next paragraph, and since now being is in truth what is most non-ordinary, being here has withdrawn completely and abandoned beings, right? Beings in the metaphysical sense are ordinary, they're accessible, they're calculable, they're caused beings and so forth. Causality is the way in which the mind controls the world, right? That's what another way of understanding his critique. Abandonment by being means that being has withdrawn from beings, and that beings have become initially, in terms of Christianity, only beings made by another being. The highest, he's not wrong to think that it was Christian theology that set up modernity. That's not the issue here. That's agreed. it has more to do with the particulars in which he understands that transfer. So beings have become initially, in terms of Christianity, only beings made by another being. And in fact, the word I substantively want to take issue with there is only. Okay? In other words, creation in somebody like Thomas definitely means that the Creator God causes to be creatures. He is the cause of the being of creatures. All right? So Heidegger says beings have become initially, in terms of Christianity, only beings made by another being. All right? So the key question is, are they only products, if I can put it crudely and directly, in terms of machination? Are they only products of another being? That's the point. All right? That's what he's saying is the case in the Christian understanding, right? And I would say this is not actually the case. The only part is false when you look carefully at Thomas. The highest being, which is related to this reading, the highest being as cause of all beings took over what is own most to being. All right? Now, what does he mean by that? That's an interesting question, right? Well, I venture the notion that what he means by that is that what is own most to being with the hyphen for him? Uniqueness and finitude is own most to being. In fact, beings only become bad in a Heideggerian non-universe, if I can put it that way, undermined universe. They only become bad when they appropriate to themselves finitude, right? When they have finitude apart from their relationship to being, right? So when he says the highest being took over what is own most to being, the highest being as the cause of being, which would be a Thomistic understanding of God as creator, took over the uniqueness and finitude of beings that properly belongs in Heidegger only to being with the hyphen, right? I think that's what he properly should be understood to be saying here. These beings, once made by the Creator God, then became of human making, insofar as now beings are taken and controlled only in their object. Boy, he puts a lot of history in that transition, right?
All of Novitas Mundi right there.
Well,
that paragraph.
Well, they then became of human making. Well, yes, there's no Descartes without Thomas. There's no question about that. The key question here, put it in those terms, is when they became of human making, and I read that to be, the truth of that to be Descartes and forward. Remember, Descartes is, in the Meditations, he understands himself as the res cogitans, as the idea of God, but the non-corporeal idea of God, which contains the idea of God, which is already the self-reflective move, you see. Here I have a non-corporeal idea of God. I am it, and I have it. In effect, he's saying, I have myself as the idea of God, is in effect what he's saying. And I have that as, because it has been stamped on me, says Descartes, by the artificer, the maker, the fabricator, the machinator, to put it in Heideggerian terms, all right? All right, so is it true that there's a transfer from the idea of creation in Thomas to modern machinations? Absolutely, clearly, right? Was that moved by Descartes fully grounded in Thomas? No, that's the point, right? Thomas may have made the setup for modernity, but he did not, in any positive sense, anticipate it. Right? How and why he didn't, I think we're going to have to leave in suspense because we pushed the clock a little bit.